My best friend scheduled her wedding on my graduation day. She got the attention she wanted. I was the first person in my family to go to college. Not just college, but medical school. 8 years of absolute hell, working 3 jobs while studying, living on instant noodles and 4 hours of sleep, missing every holiday because I had exams or hospital rotations. My parents always said they were proud, but I could tell they didn't fully understand why I put myself through it when I could have just settled down like my best friend Marissa did at 20. Marissa and I had grown up 2 houses apart, practically raised as sisters, our moms trading casseroles and carpool duty since we were in diapers. She dropped out of community college after 2 semesters to move in with her boyfriend Chad, who managed a car dealership. She spent the next 6 years planning increasingly elaborate parties for herself while I was pulling 36-hour shifts at the hospital. When I finally matched into my residency program, I called Marissa first before I even called my own parents, because that's how close we'd always been. I told her the date, May 15th, already circled in red on the calendar hanging in my tiny apartment kitchen. She squealed into the phone and said she couldn't wait to see me walk across that stage after everything I'd been through. 2 weeks later, Marissa called me screaming with excitement about her own news. Chad had finally proposed after 5 years of dating, and she wanted the big wedding she'd been dreaming about since she was 12. The date? May 15th. I told her gently at first that was my graduation day. She said she'd already looked, and there wasn't another Saturday available at her dream venue until the following spring, and she wasn't waiting a whole extra year. When I reminded her this was medical school, 8 years of my entire adult life leading up to one specific afternoon, she said I'd have plenty of other chances to feel special, but she only got to have one wedding day. I asked her what about waiting even one more month, and she said the caterer, the florist, and the venue were already locked in for that exact weekend, and changing anything would cost her thousands of dollars in deposits she couldn't get back. Marissa immediately called our mothers, who still talked on the phone every single day like they had for 30 years, crying about how I was trying to ruin her wedding. She told them I demanded she reschedule her entire event just so people would pay attention to me instead of her. She said I'd always been a little jealous of how easily things came together for her, and now I was trying to sabotage the best day of her life out of spite. My own mother called me sounding disappointed, saying Marissa's mother was devastated and that our 2 families had never had this kind of tension between them before. My dad said that since Marissa was basically like a second daughter to them, they felt caught in the middle and didn't think it was fair to ask her to move her wedding. They said they'd already RSVP'd to Marissa's wedding months ago as a courtesy, back before either date had been announced as a conflict, and they didn't want to be the ones to back out now. They chose her wedding. I told them I understood completely and wished Marissa nothing but happiness. Then I got strategic. First, I called my extended family personally to tell them about my graduation. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and everyone who'd watched me struggle through 8 years of school. I told them how much it would mean to finally have them there for something this big. Every single one of them already knew about Marissa's wedding, since our families had been intertwined for decades and the invitations had gone out to basically the same guest list. But when they heard it fell on the exact same day I was becoming a doctor, every one of them said they'd rather be at my graduation. My uncle, who'd quietly covered some of my textbook costs over the years without ever making a big deal of it, said he wasn't about to miss watching his investment pay off. My grandmother, who Marissa's mother had been counting on to help cover the cost of the flowers as a longtime family friend, said she'd rather watch her granddaughter become a doctor than sit through another young woman's 3rd venue change in 5 years. Then I reached out to the family friends who'd known both of us since we were kids in the same backyard. I told them how excited I was to finally be finished after everything it had taken to get here. Every single one of them picked my graduation. Even Marissa's own godmother, who'd promised to read a poem at the ceremony, said she'd rather see actual medical school pay off than sit through a wedding toast for the 3rd fiancé Marissa had been engaged to since high school. The best part was when I called Chad's parents directly. They'd always felt a quiet embarrassment about missing my white coat ceremony 2 years earlier, back when Marissa had thrown a tantrum about needing them at her birthday brunch that same weekend instead. When they heard she'd scheduled her actual wedding over my medical school graduation this time, Chad's mother went completely silent on the phone for a long moment, then said she was furious that Marissa had done this exact thing before and she wasn't going to reward it a second time. She said they'd be at my graduation, supporting someone who'd actually built something real with her own 2 hands. 2 weeks before the big day, Marissa realized her guest list had shrunk from over 130 people down to somewhere around 25. She called me sobbing, demanding I call everyone back and tell them to come to her wedding instead. I played dumb and said I thought she wanted people there who genuinely supported her anyway. She tried to get her own mother to guilt people into switching back, but my mother was too embarrassed by then to make those calls after everyone had already committed to my graduation. Marissa ended up having to postpone the whole wedding because her venue had a strict minimum headcount clause in the contract that her shrunken guest list couldn't meet. A mutual friend from our old neighborhood, a woman named Priya, who'd known both of us since elementary school, called me the same night Marissa's venue confirmed the postponement. She said Marissa had shown up at her apartment unannounced, sobbing on her couch for 2 hours straight, insisting the whole thing was my fault for being petty and competitive. Priya said she'd sat there quietly at first, not wanting to take sides, but eventually she'd asked Marissa the one question nobody else seemed willing to ask out loud, which was why she'd picked that exact date in the first place when she knew perfectly well tell what day my graduation was. Priya said Marissa had gone quiet for a long moment before admitting, almost under her breath, that she'd wanted her wedding to finally be the biggest thing happening in our friend group that year, since it felt like everyone had spent the last several years talking about my rotations and my exams and my matches, and she wanted just one day that was entirely about her. Priya told me she hadn't known what to say to that, and honestly, neither did I when she repeated it back to me over the phone. It confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to fully believe, that this had never really been about a scheduling conflict or non-refundable deposits at all. It had been about resentment that had been quietly building for years, finally boiling over into something loud enough that everyone around us could see it. The week after Marissa postponed everything, my phone stayed unusually quiet. No calls from my parents, no texts from Marissa, nothing at all. But my extended family kept reaching out asking what time the ceremony started and where they should park. My aunt called to say she was bringing my younger cousins, and they were thrilled to watch me walk across that stage. My uncle texted asking if I needed anything at all before the big day. Every single confirmation felt like a small win stacking up, but the silence from my parents and from the girl I used to call my sister from another mother sat heavy in my chest anyway. My grandmother called on a Thursday morning while I was making coffee in my cramped apartment kitchen. Her voice sounded sharper than usual, edged with something I didn't recognize at first. She told me she was bringing me something special for graduation, something that would make up for years of feeling like I had to fight for a seat at the table in my own life. She didn't say it outright, but I could hear how angry she was on my behalf, angry at my parents for choosing appearances over their own daughter, and knowing that someone in my life could see clearly how wrong the whole situation was made my throat tighten in the best and worst way at once. I spent most of that week buried in the medical school library, studying cardiac pathology for my final exams in a building that had emptied out since most students had already finished. I liked having the quiet space to spread my materials across an entire table without worrying about anyone else. My friend Delaney dropped into the chair across from me one afternoon and took one look at my face before asking what was wrong. I tried to brush it off as exam stress, but she kept staring until I finally told her everything. Marissa's wedding landing on my graduation day, my parents choosing appearances over me, the calls I'd made, the guest list collapsing. Delaney didn't say anything for a moment, just reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Then she told me her entire family was coming to my graduation now because I deserved people who actually showed up and celebrated me without complication. That's when I finally cried, right there in the library, for the first time since the whole mess had started. She hugged me across the table while I ugly cried into her sleeve, and I realized how long I'd been holding all of it in without letting myself feel any of it. 2 days later, my residency program director, Dr. Ferris, called me into his office, and my stomach dropped immediately, certain I'd missed some deadline or requirement I didn't even know existed. I walked down that hallway with my heart pounding, running through every possible mistake. But when I sat down across from him, he smiled at me instead. He said word had gotten around the hospital about my family situation, and the staff wanted to do something special for graduation day. He explained that everyone had been talking about how I'd worked 3 jobs through rotations without ever once complaining or asking for special treatment, and that watching me push through everything had taught him more about real dedication than any textbook could. I left that office feeling steadier than I had in weeks, like maybe I had more people in my corner than I'd realized. Chad called me that evening, which caught me completely off guard, since we'd never really talked one-on-one in all the years he'd been with Marissa. He apologized on her behalf, said he'd tried to talk her out of picking that specific weekend, but she wouldn't budge. His voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard from him before. Then he mentioned, almost like it slipped out without permission, that they'd started talking to a couples counselor. That surprised me more than anything, because Marissa always talked about their relationship like it was effortless, like they never disagreed about a single thing. I realized things between them were probably far shakier than anyone outside their apartment ever saw, and despite everything, I felt a small twist of sympathy for Chad, caught in the middle of something he hadn't fully signed up for. My mother texted me the next morning asking if we could talk. I read her message 3 times, searching for an actual apology or any acknowledgement of what had happened, but the whole thing was focused on how devastated Marissa's mother was, how the postponement had embarrassed both families in front of everyone they knew. Nothing about me, nothing about 8 years of work being dismissed without a second thought. I waited a few hours before responding with a short message saying I was happy to talk after graduation, once I had more time. She didn't reply right away, and when she finally did, it was just a plain okay. She knew there was nothing left for her to bargain with. 3 days before graduation, my uncle took me to dinner at a quiet steakhouse downtown. We talked about my residency placement and the specialty I was leaning toward. Then he pulled an envelope out of his jacket pocket and slid it across the table without saying anything at first. Inside was a check covering the exact remaining balance of my student loans from my final semester. My hands actually started shaking. He told me watching me push through without real support at home reminded him of putting himself through trade school decades earlier with nobody behind him either. He said he was proud to help me start my career without that debt hanging over my shoulders. And when I tried to argue that it was too much, he just waved me off and told me to accept it and stop fighting him on it. I hugged him in the parking lot afterward and couldn't stop thanking him. Marissa posted something online the next day. I saw it scrolling through my phone between study sessions, a long paragraph about how betrayal from the people closest to you hurt worse than anything else. stories about how people who claim to love you could turn their backs the moment you needed them most. She was clearly trying to frame herself as the wronged party, painting me as the villain who'd ruined her wedding out of jealousy. I watched the comments roll in underneath it, and her plan backfired in real time. Person after person congratulated me on medical school instead of offering her sympathy. Even a few of her own bridesmaids commented that scheduling a wedding over someone's medical school graduation, especially a lifelong best friend's, was a genuinely selfish move. One of her coworkers wrote that she should have known better than to test people's loyalty like that. I checked back a couple of hours later, and the whole post had vanished. Delaney's mother, Christine, called me that afternoon and invited me over for dinner before graduation, saying she wanted to do something special since my own family hadn't stepped up the way they should have. When I got to their house that evening, the whole family was there. Christine, her husband Roman, Delaney, and her younger sister Ren. They'd cooked all my favorite dishes and picked up a cake that said congratulations in blue icing. Christine hugged me at the door like I was one of her own daughters. Over dinner, she told me about a friend from her own college years who'd constantly tried to one-up her every accomplishment, someone who couldn't stand to watch anyone else shine. She said, "Sometimes the family you build for yourself matters more than the ones you were simply assigned by circumstance." Roman nodded and added that closeness on paper doesn't automatically translate into loyalty in real life. Sitting at their table, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted good things for me, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My dad called the evening before graduation. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. He actually said the words, "I'm sorry," admitted they'd gotten swept up trying to keep the peace with Marissa's family without thinking about what my achievement actually meant. It sounded sincere, like he genuinely felt the weight of it. But then he started explaining that Marissa was like a daughter to them too, and they'd been trying to be fair to both of us. I told him I accepted his apology, and I meant it, but I also knew something between us had shifted in a way that wouldn't just snap back into place. He got quiet for a moment before telling me he loved me and hoped I had a wonderful day. My grandmother arrived in town that same evening and insisted on taking me shopping right away for something to wear to the celebration dinner afterward. We went to a small boutique downtown, and she picked out a dress I never would have chosen for myself, but somehow looked exactly right once I put it on. At the register, she pulled a second envelope out of her purse and slid it into my hand without any warning. She told me she'd been quietly setting money aside specifically for this moment, that she wanted me to have something for my future I could use however I needed without a single ounce of guilt attached. I opened it in the car, and the number written on the check made me stop breathing for a second. It was enough to cover a security deposit and several months of rent on an apartment near the hospital where I'd start my residency. She squeezed my hand and told me I'd earned every bit of it through nothing but sheer stubborn determination, and that she was proud to help me start this next chapter free and clear. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. The morning of May 15th arrived with sunlight cutting through my apartment blinds, and for the first time in weeks, I woke up without that familiar weight sitting on my chest. Delaney texted that she'd pick me up in an hour. I pulled my graduation gown from the closet where it had been hanging since the week before, the dark blue fabric smooth and cool under my fingers as I laid it across the bed and started getting ready, actually taking my time with my hair for once instead of rushing through it the way I had for most of medical school. Delaney showed up right on schedule carrying 2 coffees from the shop we always went to, and she smiled when she saw my gown hanging on the back of the door. We sat at my little kitchen table drinking coffee while she told me about her parents arguing over what time they needed to leave to get decent seats, her mother wanting to go 2 hours early, her father insisting one was more than enough, landing eventually on 90 minutes as a compromise. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me her parents had been talking about me all week, how excited they were to finally watch me graduate. And then she added, almost offhand, that they already considered me a bonus daughter after all the years I'd spent at their kitchen table growing up. Something in my throat tightened at that. I realized I'd built something real over these 8 years that had nothing to do with blood, something that mattered more than the family I'd been assigned by chance. We drove to campus with the windows down, music playing loud enough that we sang along badly to songs we'd blasted during late-night study sessions. The parking lot was already filling up by the time we arrived, graduates in dark blue gowns walking in small clusters toward the auditorium doors. I spotted people I'd spent countless overnight hours with during rotations, all of us finally reaching the same finish line together. We found our assigned spots in the staging area, and the dean's assistant checked our names off a clipboard before handing us our printed programs. I ran my finger down the list until I found my own name printed there in plain black letters, and something about seeing it made the whole day suddenly feel real in a way it hadn't yet. The ceremony coordinator organized us into alphabetical order, and I ended up between 2 people I barely knew from different rotation schedules, both of us fidgeting with our caps while the music started and the doors to the auditorium opened. We filed in down the center aisle in 2 long lines, the lights bright overhead, the low hum of a full audience filling the room. I kept my eyes forward at first, but I couldn't help scanning the crowd as we walked. My grandmother sat in the front row in a deep green dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. My uncle sat beside her with his wife. Chad's parents were seated a few rows back, having come alone without Marissa. I spotted my aunt and 2 of my younger cousins near the aisle. Delaney's entire family took up almost 2 full middle rows on the left side, and Christine caught my eye and gave a small wave the second she saw me. Behind them, I recognized several faces from the hospital, including 2 nurses still in their scrubs, clearly on a break between shifts just to be there for a few minutes. I scanned further and found more familiar faces scattered throughout. Extended family I'd called weeks earlier. Family friends who'd known me since I was a kid, running around the same 2 backyards as Marissa. The support filling that room felt bigger and steadier than I'd let myself expect. When they finally called my name, I walked across the stage and took my diploma from the dean, and the applause rose louder than I was ready for. I looked out and saw my grandmother on her feet, clapping harder than anyone else in the room, several people around her rising to join her. The moment stretched out far longer than it probably actually lasted. Every missed holiday, every all-nighter, every time someone suggested I should just settle down instead of putting myself through all this, all of it collapsed into that single stretch of applause from people who genuinely understood exactly what it had taken to get here. I walked back to my seat, holding the diploma folder tight in both hands, while the rest of the names were called around me in a blur. And when it finally ended, we threw our caps into the air together the way you're supposed to, the whole auditorium breaking into noise and motion at once. People flooded toward the exits looking for their families, and I got swept along with the crowd until I made it outside, where everyone was already taking pictures in the afternoon sun. My grandmother found me first, wrapping me in a hug that lasted several long seconds, telling me she'd never been prouder of anyone in her entire life. My uncle came next, shaking my hand formally for half a second before pulling me into a real hug, his wife dabbing at her eyes with a folded tissue. She said she'd always known I'd make it, despite everything working against me, stating it plainly, like a fact rather than a compliment. Chad's mother stepped up after them, hugging me and holding on a beat longer than expected. When she pulled back, she looked me straight in the eyes and said she was sorry my own parents weren't standing where they should have been, but that she was honored to stand in their place today. Something in my careful composure cracked right then, and my eyes went wet before I could blink it back. She squeezed my hand and smiled without saying anything else. Delaney's entire family surrounded me next, Christine hugging me like one of her own daughters, Roman patting my shoulder and telling me I'd earned every bit of this day, Ren snapping what felt like 50 pictures on her phone in under a minute. Delaney stood grinning beside me while her family arranged us into different combinations for photos, my grandmother insisting on one just the 2 of us, my uncle wanting a shot with his whole family, plus me squeezed into the middle. The nurses from the hospital found me in the crowd just long enough to congratulate me before heading back to their shift, one of them mentioning she'd specifically traded with a coworker to make it here in time. The whole scene felt overwhelming in the best way I'd ever experienced. Christine announced she'd booked a private room at a small Italian place downtown for 6 o'clock, big enough to fit everyone who'd come. My grandmother said that sounded perfect, and we all agreed to meet there, scattering slowly toward the parking lot. I rode with Delaney again, windows down, music turned up loud, singing badly along to the same songs from our late-night study sessions. When we arrived, the private room was already set with a long table for 20, appetizers laid out and waiting. Everyone found their seats, plates started passing around, and conversation rose into a happy, overlapping noise. I sat between my grandmother and Delaney, right in the center of it all. Christine stood partway through the meal and tapped her glass with a fork until the room quieted. She talked about how proud she was watching me chase this for 8 years through pure stubbornness, about the late nights I'd spent studying at their kitchen table when I needed somewhere quiet, and said watching me never quit had taught her own daughters something real about following through even when things got hard. Roman stood next and added his own memory, finding me asleep at their table at 2 in the morning, surrounded by scattered textbooks, saying he'd never met anyone with that kind of focus. My face went hot while they talked, and everyone lifted their glasses together. My phone buzzed in my purse partway through dinner. 3 texts from my mom, 2 from my dad, all saying they were proud, asking for pictures from the day. My dad's message said he wished he could have been there. I read them twice, the words landing hollow after everything that had already happened, and sent back a couple of photos without adding anything of my own. My mom responded instantly with a string of heart emojis. My dad tried calling, and I let it go straight to voicemail, setting my phone face down and picking my fork back up. For the first time all day, keeping that distance didn't feel heavy at all. It just felt like the truth. Another message came through a few minutes later, this one from Marissa, long enough to fill the entire screen. She said she was sorry that she hadn't understood how much this day actually meant to me. Then she spent 3 paragraphs explaining wedding stress and feeling like her own life was falling behind mine, saying she'd made a bad call under pressure and hoped I could eventually understand. The apology was so buried under justification, it barely registered as one. I typed back a short reply saying I appreciated her reaching out, then put the phone face down again and turned my attention back to the people actually sitting around that table. My grandmother rose near the end of the meal and tapped her glass once more, waiting until the whole table settled. She said she'd been thinking a lot lately about what family really means, that it comes down to showing up, to being present for the moments that actually matter, to supporting each other without needing to be convinced first. She looked around the table slowly. She said she'd decided to update her will to reflect exactly that, to reflect who had actually shown up when it counted. She didn't say my parents' names out loud, but nobody at that table needed her to. She turned to me directly and said the house was going to be mine when the time came, because I was the one who visited, who called, who actually built a real real relationship with her instead of just showing up for holidays. My uncle nodded along in full agreement, and a low murmur of support moved around the table. My eyes went wet again, but I smiled through it and thanked her, and she sat back down and patted my arm like it was already settled. The whole room kept talking and laughing around me, plates emptying, glasses refilling, and for the first time in 8 long years, I let myself sit there and simply feel proud, surrounded by every single person who had actually chosen to be there.